Please, just listen to me. I know I made a mistake, but please don't do this.
There is a particular kind of silence that fills a house after someone you love decides they are finished with you. It is not loud. It does not slam doors or break dishes. It simply settles over everything you built together, every photograph on the wall, every chair at the table, and it waits. David Bennett knew that silence better than he knew his own reflection. Because on a cold Tuesday in October, his wife of 28 years sat across from him at the kitchen table they had bought. On their honeymoon, slid a folder toward him, uncapped a pen, and signed her name on the papers that ended their marriage. She did not cry. She did not pause. She did not look up. She signed the way a person signs for a package they have been expecting for a very long time. And then she handed him the pen. This is the story of that pen and the 18 months that followed it. It is the story of a man who believed he had built something permanent, only to learn that the foundation had been quietly crumbling beneath him for years while he was busy fixing the roof. It is the story of how a woman can walk away from nearly 3 decades of marriage without so much as a tremor in her hand, and how that same woman can show up on a rain-soaked porch a year and a half later, mascara running down her face, begging for a second chance she once threw away without a second thought. But more than anything, this is the story of what David discovered when she came back. Because the question was never whether he would take her back, the real question was why she had returned at all. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story takes turns that very few people see coming, and you are going to want to be here for every single one of them. Stay with us, because to understand the woman on that porch, you first have to understand the man at that kitchen table. And the life he thought he had. You have to go back to the beginning, to a time when David Bennett was certain, absolutely certain, that he was one of the luckiest men alive. He had a wife. He had 2 children. He had a small business with his name on the door. He had no idea that the ground beneath all of it had already begun to shift. David grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew your father and your father's father, where a man's word still meant something, and a handshake still closed a deal. His own father had worked with his hands his entire life, repairing engines in a garage that always smelled of oil and coffee. And David inherited 2 things from him, a quiet stubbornness and a deep belief that if you simply worked hard enough and stayed loyal enough, life would hold up its end of the bargain. He was not a talker. He was a builder. By the time he was 19, he could frame a wall, hang a door, and turn a raw plank of oak into something a family would gather around for the next 50 years. He believed in permanence. He believed that the things you made carefully were the things that lasted. He met Rachel at a county fair. The summer he turned 22. She was standing near the ticket booth in a yellow dress, laughing at something a friend had said, and David later told people that he forgot how to breathe for a moment. Rachel was everything he was not. Where he was steady, she was electric. Where he was quiet, she filled every room she entered with sound and color. And the sense that something wonderful was about to happen. She had dreams that did not fit inside their small town. Dreams of cities and travel, and a life that sparkled. David did not understand all of those dreams, but he loved the way she lit up when she talked about them. And he made himself a promise that summer. He promised himself that he would be the man who gave her that sparkling life. They married 11 months later in a small church with white flowers and folding chairs, and David meant every word of his vows, the way only a young man who has never been betrayed can mean them. For better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. He believed those words were a fortress. He did not yet understand that vows are only as strong as the two people who keep choosing them every single day, long after the flowers have wilted and the music has stopped. In those early years, the choosing was easy. They had nothing, and somehow that made them rich. They lived in a rented apartment above a hardware store, and on Friday nights they would split a single plate of spaghetti and dream out loud about the house they would build and the children they would raise. The children came first. Emma arrived on a snowy February morning, and David wept openly in the hospital hallway, this big, quiet man with sawdust still under his fingernails, undone completely by 7 pounds of a daughter who already had Rachel's stubborn chin. 2 years later came Jake, all noise and motion from the moment he could crawl, and David, who had grown up believing that a father's job was to provide, threw himself into providing with everything he had. He opened a small cabinet and woodworking shop on the edge of town, just him and one employee and a mountain of debt, and he worked. He worked early mornings and late nights and most weekends. He told himself that every hour in that shop was an act of love, that the sawdust on his clothes was proof of how much he cared. And in his mind, it was the truth. But here is the thing that David would not understand for nearly 30 years. The thing that would only become clear to him much too late. Rachel did not fall in love with a provider. She fell in love with the young man at the county fair who forgot how to breathe, the one who used to lie in the grass beside her and point at the stars and promise her a life full of color. And slowly, one missed dinner at a time, one postponed vacation at a time, one weekend in the shop at a time, that young man had been replaced by a tired figure who came home smelling of varnish, kissed her on the forehead, and fell asleep in front of the television before 9 o'clock. He thought he was building their dream. She felt herself becoming furniture in it, a fixture, something useful and reliable and entirely unseen. The years went by the way years do, quietly, and all at once the children grew. Emma went off to college and then to a city far away, building a bright life of her own. Jake followed a few years later. And the house that had once been so loud, so full of homework and arguments, and the slamming of screen doors, grew quiet in a way that neither David nor Rachel quite knew how to talk about. David filled that quiet the only way he knew how, with work. The shop had grown over the years, slowly and steadily, just the way he had built everything in his life. He had 3 employees now, then 5. He had regular customers and a small reputation for honest craftsmanship. And he believed, with the simple certainty of a man who has never had reason to doubt, that he and Rachel were simply settling into the comfortable companionship of a premier ruffle, long marriage. He thought the quiet was peace. He did not realize the quiet was distant. Looking back later, David would identify the exact year everything began to change, though he did not see it at the time. It was the year Rachel turned 50. She came home one evening with a new haircut and a gym membership, and a brightness in her eyes that David had not seen in a long while, and instead of wondering where that brightness had come from, he simply felt glad to see it. She started going out more, dinners with new friends he had never met, evenings that stretched later and later. She began leaving her phone face down on the counter, and when it buzzed, she would carry it into the other room before she answered. She stopped using his last name in certain circles, going by her maiden name again, and when David noticed it once and gently asked, she laughed and said it was just easier for her work. And he believed her, because in 28 years, he had never once had a reason not to. There were 3 signs. David would count them over and over, in the months that followed, holding each one up to the light, hating himself for missing them. The first was the money. He noticed, almost by accident, that their savings account, the rainy day fund they had built together over decades, had been slowly drained over the course of about a year into an account he did not recognize. When he mentioned it, Rachel told him she was managing it. moving it somewhere with better interest. And he let it go, because he trusted her with everything. The second sign was the solo trip. She booked a week away by herself that spring, a getaway she said she needed to clear her head. And David, feeling guilty about all the vacations they had never taken, encouraged her to go. The third sign was the one that should have been impossible to miss, and yet he missed it completely. Rachel stopped fighting with him. These small frustrations that fill any long marriage simply disappeared. He thought it meant they had finally found peace. It meant she had already left, somewhere deep inside, and a person does not fight for a thing they have already decided to lose. And then there was the phone call. About 3 weeks before that Tuesday in October, David came home early from the shop, something he almost never did, and found Rachel sitting on the edge of their bed. In the dark, the phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and unsteady in a way he had never heard before. When she saw him in the doorway, she ended the call instantly and stood up, smoothing the blanket, telling him it was just a friend, that everything was fine. But her eyes were red and her hands were shaking, and for one strange moment, David felt something cold pass through the room, a sense that he was standing at the edge of something he did not understand. He almost asked. He stood there with the question on his lips. And then Rachel smiled and asked him what he wanted for dinner. And the moment passed, and David told himself he had imagined it. He would spend a year of his life trying to understand what that phone call really was. The answer, when it finally came, would not be the one he expected. The Tuesday itself began like any other day. David had coffee at the kitchen counter, kissed Rachel on the cheek, and went to the shop. He spent the morning building a dining table for a young couple who had just bought their first home. And he remembers thinking, as he sanded the edges smooth, that the table reminded him of the one he and Rachel had bought on their honeymoon all those years ago. He came home that evening, tired and content, and Rachel was waiting for him at the kitchen table, sitting very still, with a manila folder placed neatly in front of the empty chair across from her. She asked him to sit down. There was something in her voice that made his stomach drop. Before he understood a single word, the flat, rehearsed calm of a person who has practiced a speech many times in the mirror. He sat down. He looked at the folder, and Rachel told him that she wanted a divorce. David has tried many times to describe what those next minutes felt like, and he has never quite found the words. He says, it was like watching his own life from the ceiling. Like the man sitting in that chair was a stranger he was observing from very far away. Rachel spoke calmly. She said she had been unhappy for a long time. She said she felt invisible, that she had spent decades waiting for a life that never arrived, that she could not spend whatever years she had left simply existing beside a man who came home smelling of varnish and fell asleep before 9. She said the papers were already drawn up. She had seen a lawyer. The house had already been appraised. She had thought of everything. And David, this man who had built his entire identity on permanence, on the belief that the things you make carefully are the things that last, sat in his own kitchen and listened to his wife dismantle 28 years with the cool efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. He kept waiting for the part where one of them would cry. He kept waiting for the part where she would say wait, or he would say wait, or some force in the universe would intervene and stop what was happening. That part never came. Rachel slid the folder across the table. She uncapped the pen and signed her name, and David watched her hand the entire time, watched it move across the paper without the slightest tremble, without a single moment of hesitation. And he understood in that instant that the woman across from him had already grieved this marriage in private, long ago, months or even years before. And that he was the only one in the room who was learning the news today. He was the last to know about the ending of his own story. And then she held out the pen to him. And David, numb and hollow and utterly unable to fight, took it. And he signed. People have asked David, many times since, why he did not fight, why he did not beg, or rage, or refuse to sign, and his answer is always the same. He says, "You do not fight a verdict." By the time the papers reached that kitchen table, the trial was already over. It had been held in private, over a period of years, in a courtroom he had never been invited to enter, and the sentence had already been passed. He could have shouted, he could have torn the folder in two, but none of it would have changed the simple, brutal fact written on Rachel's steady hand. She was already gone. She had been gone for a long time. The papers were only the formality that made it official. So he signed his name beneath hers, and he set the pen down on the table, and his marriage of 28 years was over before the coffee in the pot had even gone cold. In the days that followed, David moved through his life like a man underwater. Rachel moved out within the week, into an apartment across town that, he would later realize, she had already arranged before she ever told him a word. The house that had once held the noise of 2 children and the warmth of a family became museum of a life that no longer existed. He would come home from the shop and stand in the doorway of the empty bedroom or sit at the kitchen table staring at the chair where she had signed the papers. And the silence would settle over him. That particular silence, the one that does not slam doors but simply waits. He stopped cooking. He ate standing at the counter, when he ate at all. He slept on the couch, because the bed felt like a country he had been exiled from. And the worst part, he says, was not the loneliness. The worst part was the not knowing why. Because Rachel had given him a reason, but the reason did not add up. People do not plan a divorce for a year, drain a savings account in secret, arrange an apartment and a lawyer and an appraisal, all because their husband fell asleep too early in front of the television. There was a piece missing, a hole in the center of the story, and David, who had spent his whole life as a builder, could not stop trying to fit the pieces together. He began to notice things he had not noticed before, in that terrible clarity that comes after a loss. A name he did not recognize on an old phone bill. A charge at a restaurant in a city 2 hours away. On a night, Rachel had said she was working late, the drained savings, flowing into an account he had never seen. And slowly, against every instinct that told him to leave it alone, David began to do something he had never done in his entire marriage. He began to investigate the woman he had loved. What he found over the course of several long and painful weeks was a name. Mark. Mark was a real estate developer from the city 2 hours away. A man with expensive suits and a loud laugh and a life that sparkled in exactly the way Rachel had always dreamed her own life might one day sparkle. David pieced it together the way he pieced together everything, slowly and carefully and with a craftsman's patience. They had met at one of those dinners with the new friends, the ones David had never been invited to. It had started, as these things do, with conversation, with attention, with a man who looked at Rachel and saw the electric young woman in the yellow dress, instead of the reliable fixture in someone else's home. Mark had offered her the thing that David lost in his shop and his sawdust and his belief that providing was the same as loving had stopped offering her years before. He had offered her the feeling of being seen. And here is where David's understanding of his own marriage came apart and had to be rebuilt from nothing. Because at first, he assumed it was simply an affair, a betrayal of the oldest and simplest kind. But the more he learned, the more the timeline troubled him. Rachel had begun pulling away before Mark, not after. The brightness, the gym, the maiden name, the quiet, all of it had begun before this man ever entered the picture. Which meant that Mark was not the cause of the ending. Mark was the door. Rachel had been standing in the hallway of their marriage for years, searching for a way out, and Mark had simply been the exit that finally opened. It was a distinction that should not have mattered. And yet to David it mattered enormously, because it meant the marriage had not been stolen from him by another man. It had been quietly abandoned, long before, by the woman he had trusted with everything. While he stood in the next room and noticed that realization nearly destroyed him. For a period of several months, David was not himself. He let the shop slide. Orders went unfinished. His employees, good men who had worked beside him for years, covered for him as best they could. But David could not focus on a single thing. He had built his entire identity on two pillars, his work and his marriage, and one of them had simply collapsed without warning, and now he found that he could no longer stand on the other. He says there were mornings he could not think of a single reason to get out of bed. He, a man who had built things his whole life, could not build one reason to go on. The children called, worried. Emma flew home for a weekend and found her father gaunt and hollow-eyed in a house full of dust, and she sat with him at that same kitchen table and held his hand and told him that he was going to survive this, even though neither of them entirely believed it yet. And it was Emma, in the end, who said the thing that turned him. She told him, gently but without flinching, that he had spent his entire life trying to figure out why people did things, and that this time the why did not matter. She told him that he could spend the rest of his years sitting at that table, holding the broken pieces up to the light, trying to understand a decision that was never his to understand. Or he could put the pieces down and ask himself a different question entirely. Not why did she leave, but who am I going to be now that she's gone? It was such a simple thing, and yet it landed in David like a key turning in a lock. He had been so consumed by solving the mystery of Rachel that he had forgotten there was another person in the story whose ending had not yet been written. Himself, so David made a decision. He decided to stop investigating his marriage and start rebuilding his life. It did not happen all at once, the way these things never do, but it began. He went back to the shop, and this time he did not just go through the motions. He poured himself into the work the way he had when he was young and hungry and full of dreams. Except now the dreams were entirely his own. He took on projects he would never have dared to attempt before. Ambitious custom pieces, intricate designs, the kind of work that other people called art, and David simply called paying attention. He stopped eating standing at the counter and started cooking real meals again, just for himself, learning that taking care of one person could be its own quiet form of dignity. He reconnected with old friends he had let drift away during the long years of marriage, and slowly, almost without noticing, he began to feel the strangest thing. He began to feel like himself again. The turning point for the business came from a single piece. David had spent the better part of a winter building a dining table, a massive thing of figured walnut, with a live edge that followed the natural curve of the tree it had come from, joined by hand in the old way, without a single nail or screw. He had not built it for a customer. He had built it for himself in the long evenings, because the work kept the silence at bay. A photographer friend saw it in the shop one day and asked if he could take some pictures. And those pictures found their way onto the internet. And something about that table, the honesty of it, the patience of it, struck a chord with people David would never meet. The orders began to come in. First a trickle, then a flood. People from across the country wanted a piece of work made by the man who had built that table, the little shop on the edge of town, the one Rachel had once dismissed as his little hobby. Suddenly had a waiting list, 18 months long. David's life, the life he had rebuilt board by board from the wreckage, began to fill up with good things. The business thrived. A regional magazine ran a feature on him, a quiet profile of a Midwestern craftsman finding unexpected success in his 50s, complete with a photograph of David standing in his shop, sawdust in the air around him. Looking for the first time in a very long while, like a man at peace, his relationship with his children deepened into something richer than it had ever been. no longer mediated by the distractions of a struggling marriage. He even found himself, on a few easy evenings, sharing a quiet dinner with a kind woman who appreciated his company. Nothing serious, just the gentle rediscovery that he was still a man capable of being wanted. And one evening, sitting alone on his back porch with a cup of coffee, as the sun went down, David realized that the silence in the house no longer felt like something was missing. It felt like room to breathe. He thought that chapter of his life was closed for good. He had made his peace with the ending. He had stopped checking for Rachel's name, stopped wondering where she was or what she was doing, or whether she ever thought of him at all. He had, after the hardest year of his life, finally let her go, and that, of course, is precisely when she came back. It began with a text message on a Thursday evening in spring from a number David had deleted long ago, but had never managed to forget. Just 3 words. "I miss you." He stared at his phone for a long time before he set it down without answering. The next day there was another, then a phone call he did not pick up, then a voicemail, her voice thick with tears, asking if they could talk, just talk, saying she had made a mistake, the biggest mistake of her life. And David, sitting in the house he had reclaimed, felt the strangest mixture of feelings rise up in him. Not joy, not even anger, just a deep and weary curiosity. Why now? She came to the house on a rainy evening about a week later. David heard the knock and opened the door, and there she was, standing on the porch in the rain, her mascara running down her face, holding a small box of things she said she had found that belonged to him. But they both knew the box was just an excuse. Rachel had not come to return a box. She had come to ask for a second chance. She stood there in the doorway of the home they had once shared, the home she had walked away from without a tremor in her hand, and she begged. She told him she had been a fool. She told him she saw everything clearly now, that she understood what she had thrown away, that she had spent 18 months learning the difference between the life she had imagined and the life she had actually had. She asked him, with tears in her eyes, if he could ever forgive her, if there was any way at all that they could begin again. And David, standing in that doorway, did something he had not expected to do. He invited her in out of the rain. He made her a cup of coffee, the way he had 10,000 mornings before, and they sat down at the kitchen table, at the very table where she had once signed her name without hesitation. And they talked. And slowly, over the course of that long evening, the truth came out. The truth about Mark, first. The sparkling life had not sparkled for long. Mark, it turned out, had been a man who enjoyed the chase far more than the prize. The attention that had felt like sunlight had cooled within a year. The travel and the restaurants and the expensive suits had been a stage set. And once Rachel had given up everything to step onto that stage, she discovered that there was nothing behind it. Mark had moved on to someone newer. Someone he could look at the way he had once looked at her, and Rachel had found herself exactly where she had been most afraid of ending up. Alone, the grass had not been greener. The grass had been painted, and as Rachel spoke, David felt the old anger he had expected to feel, the vindication, the bitter satisfaction of being proven right. But he did not feel it for long. Because there was more to the story, and the rest of it was the part that David had been searching for all those months, the missing piece, the hole at the center. He asked her, finally, about the phone call. The one 3 weeks before the papers, when he had found her sitting in the dark with shaking hands, and Rachel went very quiet, and then she told him. 3 weeks before she signed those papers, she had found a lump. She had spent days, terrified, certain it was the end, lying awake beside a sleeping husband. She felt she could no longer reach, doing the cruelest arithmetic a person can do, counting the years she might have left and measuring them against the life she had actually been living. The lump turned out to be nothing, a scare and not a sentence. But the arithmetic had already done its work. That, she told him, was the real reason, not Mark. Not the money, not the dinners or the maiden name, or the man with the expensive suits. The terror of that phone call, the cold certainty that her time was running out and that she had spent it, disappearing inside someone else's dream, had pushed her over an edge she had been standing near for years. She had panicked. She had looked at her quiet, reliable husband and seen not a partner but a cage, and she had run for the nearest open door without ever once stopping to ask whether the man inside the cage was actually the one holding the key. It was, David realized, the most human thing he had ever heard. And it was also, he understood with a clarity that surprised him, completely beside the point. Because understanding why a person hurt you does not undo the hurt, and forgiving a person is not the same as trusting them again. So David sat with all of it. The collapse of Mark, the health scare she had hidden from him, the 18 months of a life she now regretted. He sat with the woman he had loved for most of his adult life, who was weeping at his kitchen table, asking him to open the door he had finally, painfully managed to close. And in the quiet of that moment, David understood something that he had not understood before, something that explained the strange weariness he had felt from the first text message. He realized that Rachel had not come back to him. She had come back to his life. She had heard somehow through the small town channels that carry such news about the magazine feature and the waiting list as this and the success of the little shop she had once dismissed. She had returned not when he was broken, not in the months when he could barely get out of bed, not when he needed her most. She had returned now, when his life had finally become the kind of life she could be proud to stand beside. When it had finally started to sparkle, he did not say this to wound her. He said it quietly, almost gently, because by then there was no anger left in him at all. He told her that he forgave her. And he meant it, completely, because he had learned over those 18 months that forgiveness was a gift he gave to himself, a way of setting down a weight he had carried for far too long. But forgiveness, he told her, and a second chance were two different doors, and he had only opened one of them. He told her that the man she had left, the tired figure who came home smelling of varnish and fell asleep before 9, was gone, and that the man who had taken his place had been built out of the very wreckage she had left behind. He told her that he had worked too hard and hurt too much and come too far to hand the keys to that hard-won life to someone who had only wanted it back once it was worth something. Rachel asked him then, through her tears, how he could be so certain, how he could sit there so calm and whole when she was falling apart. And she said the thing that David would never forget, the thing he still hears sometimes in the quiet of his shop. She looked at him and she said, "I never thought you would actually be fine without me." And David realized in that instant that she had named the entire truth without meaning to, because being fine without her was not the tragedy she imagined it to be. It was the whole point. It was the thing he had been forced to learn in the loneliest year of his life, the lesson that had nearly killed him and had ultimately set him free. He had spent 28 years believing that his worth was measured by how useful he was to someone else, how well he provided, how much he could carry, and it had taken her leaving for him to learn that a man's life can belong, fully and completely, to the man himself. He walked her to the door. The rain had stopped. He told her, without bitterness, that he hoped she would find the life she was looking for, and that he believed she could, but that she would have to build it herself this time, out of her own hands, the way he had built his. And then David did the one thing he had been unable to do. At that kitchen table 18 months before, the thing he had not even known he was capable of, he chose. For the first time in the entire story, the decision was entirely his own, and he made it not in numbness and not in shock, but in full and quiet possession of himself. He said goodbye to Rachel, and then he closed the door, gently, the same door she had once walked out of without a backward glance. And he stood for a moment in the warm light of the home he had reclaimed, and he listened to the silence. And the silence, for the first time, sounded like peace. People still ask David whether he regrets it, whether he lies awake at night wondering what would have happened if he had opened that second door, if he had taken her back, if he had tried to rebuild the life they once had. And his answer surprises them every time. He says no. He says he does not regret it. And more than that, he does not even regret the divorce itself. The cold seismic, the steady hand, the pen handed back across the table. Because the day Rachel signed those papers without hesitation, he tells them she did not end his life. She handed it back to him. She forced him, against his will and at terrible cost, to discover that he was a whole man on his own, capable of building a good life out of nothing but his own 2 hands and his own stubborn heart. He just did not recognize the gift for a very long time. He thought it was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. It turned out to be the thing that finally set him free. And so David Bennett's story does not end in a courtroom, or on a rainy porch, or at a kitchen table with a folder and a pen. It ends in a workshop on the edge of a small Ohio town where an aging craftsman builds tables that families will gather around for the next 50 years, things made carefully, things meant to last. It ends with a man who learned, far too late and yet not too late at all, that the most important thing he would ever build was not a marriage, or a business, or a house. It was himself. The marriage he thought was permanent turned out to be the one thing he could not make last by working harder. But the man he became when it fell apart, the man who learned to sit in the silence and finally call it peace, that man was the truest thing he ever made. And no one, not even the woman who once walked away without hesitation, could ever take him apart again. So now we turn the question to you. Was David right to close that door, to forgive without forgetting, to let her go for good? Or does everyone, no matter how badly they have hurt us, deserve a second chance to make things right? And for the men watching this, the ones who have sat at their own version of that kitchen table, we want to hear from you most of all. Would you have signed your name back across that table the way David did? Or would you have fought with everything you had to save what you thought you had built? There are no easy answers, and that is exactly why we want to hear yours. Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if you saw a piece of your own life somewhere in David's, then subscribe and stay with us, because every week we tell another true-to-life story about betrayal, dignity, and the second chances that people do and do not deserve.